Hello everyone and welcome to Live with Janome. I'm Miriam Coffey and welcome to my studio. I hope you guys are having a great day because I'm really excited about this project. We are going to be doing one of my favorite things, which is repurposing. I love finding new uses for things, whether that is for a foot on my Janome sewing machine or for an old t-shirt like this. This is called the t-shirt tote. And it is just a simple tote bag using old t-shirts. I am a huge fan of tote bags. In my motto, you can never have too many of them. And that's probably just because I never have any because my family always steals mine. And they say that I'm the only one that can make them, which, as we all know, we all can sew and they can learn it too. And you're gonna learn how to make this project, and maybe your family members will also learn how to do it so they don't steal your adorable totes. So we're going to be making really cute t-shirt totes for all of those t-shirts that either don't fit you anymore, or if you're not really a t-shirt person but you have a really cute t-shirt from a concert or a quilt show that you went to. So this is what we're going to be making those projects with, or all those t-shirts. We're going to use that for this tote. So let's go over some supplies. So first we're going to need is our t-shirt. So I have my t-shirt here. And this is just an old t-shirt from the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival that I used to go to all the time in college when I lived up in Baltimore. So for all of my Baltimore people or Maryland, say, hey, sheep and wool. So we have our t-shirt. We're going to need some just fabric scissors, some pins, a marking utensil, a small ruler. It has about a 1.5 inch square. That's all we need. And then a larger ruler, our cutting station, basic sewing stuff, as well as we need a lining fabric for our tote, as well as 2 yards of cotton webbing. I prefer the cotton webbing over the nylon webbing because I think it feels better, it wears better, and it just is nicer on your shoulders. The nylon webbing does sometimes come in more colors, but I still prefer the cotton. I think it just wears better, and as you can see, it kind of, since the shirt's also cotton, it kind of blends in a little bit nicer. It has the same feel, and it doesn't have that like sheen that the nylon does. As well as you're going to need a iron-on fusible. I prefer the Pellon SF 101, and that is a woven fusible. So let's get this stuff out of the way. So this is a fusible interfacing that is made with woven fabric. So it actually, if I take this apart, you can kind of see, you might be able to see that there are actual threads here. So it is woven fabric with the bumpy side, which is the fusible element. It does also come in white and black. And I use this stuff a lot of the times more than the non-woven because this has a little bit better drape. It's going to, because it's fabric, when you fuse it to other fabric, it's going to drape better. It's not going to have that stiff feel that sometimes when you use a fusible interfacing, what that does, that kind of crunchy feel. When you use that woven, it doesn't give you quite that same feeling. So again, that's the SF 101, Pellon woven fusible interfacing. So we would need 2 pieces for that. And this is, these, I'm not going to give you specific measurements for any of these because your bag is going to be determined by the size of your graphic as well as the size of your shirt. So in general, you'll need about a yard of fabric for a t-shirt, and then around a yard of the interfacing. But again, that will change a little bit depending on the size of your shirt. So if yours is a little bit different, don't worry. So the first thing we're going to do is first I pressed my shirt so it's a little bit slightly less wrinkly. And it's a little off center, but it's okay because I'm going to cut it down. When I tried to center it up a little bit more, it got a little wonky. So I just pressed it kind of the way it stayed like this, where it's pretty good. And we're going to square it all up later. So don't worry about making it super perfect right now. We're just going to basically hack off the sleeves. So let's go ahead and just chop these off. And then if your t-shirt has side seams, just go ahead and cut up the side seams. I'm going to cut off the top here. And I'm just going to cut through the neckline just because I want to, since I'm not quite sure if I'm cutting this perfectly straight, I'd rather just have a little bit of extra so that I can square it up exactly the way I want. Cut off my sleeves here. And like I was mentioning before, if your t-shirt has side seams, go ahead and cut on the side seam. If it doesn't, just cut on your fold. So I have a fold here, and I'm just going to take my scissors, cut along here. Again, also, if you had your cutting mat, you could also just cut straight on top of it that way, but don't cut it into its perfect shape just yet, because the fabric, I find when you're working with knits, before you stabilize them, they're going to be unstable and a little bit more unruly. So by cutting them bigger, stabilizing them, and then cutting them down, then we'll be able to get the perfect square bag or rectangular shaped bag that we want. So now that my t-shirt is kind of prepped here, it's now two pieces. So I have my front and my back. Now this is when I would go to my iron and press my interfacing to the back side of the front and the back of my tote. And I have this next step ready for us. And this is the perfect time if you have a press, if you have like one of our Elna presses, this is a fantastic time to break out your press, because when you're ironing larger surfaces, being able to press really fast and even, it's so much faster and more effective than your just regular iron. But if you have a regular iron, it will also work great too. So this is the next shirt that I have. So as you can see, it's very rough around the edges. I have the interfacing ironed onto the back, so it's not going to be stretching at all like a normal t-shirt would. So now I have my t-shirt, and as you can see, it's a little wonky. This is when we would take it to our cutting board and use our rotary cutter to cut out the size that we want. Now, the size that you want can vary on the graphic, and then also the size of the t-shirt. So I'm going to say, I'm not necessarily going to go off of a specific end result size, but I have found that the ones that I've been making, at least for these step outs, they're around 17, 18 inches, sort of wide. But again, the size of your shirt will change that. The other thing I want to point out here is when you are cutting it out, make sure that you do have a specific graphic that you're working with, especially if there's words or anything horizontal or vertical. You want to be able to line up your grid so that your graphic isn't wonky, unless you wanted it perfect, like purposely wonky, which is also totally fun too. I'm sure that could look pretty cute. But if you want it straight, make sure that you're lining off of the graphic itself. And then also if there's any side measurements, you want to make sure that you copy that on the right and the left side, and then square up the top and square up the bottom. And then once you have that measurement, you will then copy that measurement and cut it out on the back side of the t-shirt so that you'll have the front and the back the same. And then you'll do the same thing for your lining for that. So you'll have 4 pieces that are the same measurement. And again, that measurement will be determined by the shirt that you're actually working with. So now I have the next step. This is my next t-shirt. And I have my front and back, as well as my lining fabric. And all 4 of these are the same sizes. And now there's a few markings that are going to be consistent. So this will be the same regardless if it is whatever size the shirt that you're working with. There are a few marks that are going to be more universal. So there's a few marks right up here. So on the top of all four, you want to mark 3.5 inches. And that is going to be our placement for our straps. So we are going to be sewing our straps on the inside of here, and we will go over that in a second. But we first want to make those marks for 3.5 inches on both the front and the back, as well as a 1.5 inch square on both sides, on the front and the back, as well as your lining. So now we have our front and the back cut out, we have our straps marked, we have our boxed corners marked. We can move on. So this is what the box corners will look like once you have, this is my lining. I have cut out my corners, and then I have also marked my start and stop line for when I am going to sew this together. And when I make linings to bags, what I like to do is I like to sew with the line starting from the raw edge here, and I would sew in, and then I'd pivot at my seam allowance, which is going to be 1/2 inch, and then I would sew down along that line. And that's going to give me a little L shape, and I can stitch that out if we, so it makes maybe a little bit more sense. So I'm going to just stitch this out so you can kind of see. I'm going to start sewing, and then when I get to that 1/2 inch point, pivot, and then sew. And I actually had my needle position in the wrong, not in the 1/2 inch, so it's a little wonky. And then I'm going to reverse at my ends. And then I would do the same thing where I would sew along the bottom, sew along the opposite side. And as you can see here, by sewing this little L shape here, when I turn this right side out, this angle here is going to push my seam allowance into the inside of the bag, so it will give me a much cleaner finish, and it will be a lot easier to sew this opening shut. And again, I would do the same thing up here. So I would sew my little L at my 1/2 inch seam allowance on the top of it, and again, reversing, and then reversing at all of your starts and stops. All right, next we're going to go over boxed corners. So there are several different ways to box corners, but this is the way I prefer to do it. And you can box your corners at really any dimension that you want. For this particular project, I find 1.5 inches is a really pretty decent size for a bag. But again, you can make it smaller or larger if you prefer. So I've already marked my 1.5 inch square here at the bottom. I've cut that out, and I've already sewn around the two sides. And now all I have to do, it's very simple, is I have to pinch it so that you're lining up your two seam allowances on top of each other. And one seam allowance is going to go one way and the other seam allowance is going to go the other. It doesn't matter which direction it goes. And this is very thick fabric, so I'm going to pin this into place. So you can see here, those are matching up, and you have a nice perfect seam there at the bottom. And that's when I can pin this into place. And then I would take this to my machine, and I would sew my 1/2 inch along that line. And then once I sewed that, I do also reverse at the beginning and the end, and I do have a tendency of reversing at that seam just for some extra stability. And then you'll have your boxed corner. So it will look like that. And then you would do that for the other side of the bag. And so that's how you box a corner. Oh, that's one way to box a corner. So now that we have our lining done, so we have our lining done, it has our opening on the lining here. I have my little L, like I mentioned before. I have a little L there, about 4 or 5 inches, basically enough that you can stick my hand through. And then L on that side, reverse. I've boxed my corners at the bottom. And I've done the same thing on the outside of the bag. Again, I have my 3.5 inches marked here, and now I'm going to sew on my straps. So we have a 1-inch cotton webbing, and I have 2 yards of it. So I've cut the yards in half, so now I have a yard for each side. So I have already actually sewn down one side, but I'm going to show you how I'll do this side. So I'm going to flip this over. And I'm going to just kind of tuck that back a little bit so you can see, so hopefully you can see this mark. So I have my 3.5 inch markings right here. And now I'm going to place my 1-inch cotton webbing on the inside of that. And then that's when I will pin this into place. And then I would take that to the machine, sew that back and forth a few times. And then I want to sew my other, or line my other strap up. And again, you always want to make sure that you're not twisting your straps. So it's always better to check to make sure that it's okay. And then you can always, what I always do is I pin it into place, and then I'll like put it on my shoulder and just to make sure that I did it right before I sew it down, because I would rather not have to rip that all out, because I have a tendency of sewing my straps down pretty well. So that looks good. It's not twisted. So now I've lifted that up. It's not twisted around in any sort of funky way. And then now this is when I would take this to my machine and sew this down. And this is going to be at like a 1/4 inch, really doesn't matter. It's basically just to keep it down as long as it's under, as long as it's smaller than your 1/2 inch seam allowance, you're golden. So now, as you can see, I've gotten that one sewn down. And let's do the same thing for the other strap. Line that up, lower it down. I'm going to stop here just so I can pull out my pin. And we're going to sew and then reverse just a few times, just because I really like to make sure that my straps are secure. And then we're going to cut our threads. So now I have both sides of my tote with the straps sewn on. Now it's time to put this together. So I have the right side of my outside of my bag, and then I'm going to put that with the right side of my lining. I'm going to stick that into it. So it's basically pretty sides to pretty sides. Stick that in. And then the other thing that you want to do is anytime you're doing bags or matching seams, it's always a good idea to make sure that your seam allowance is always going in the same direction. So I have my seam allowance here sewn down on the box corner going away from me. So that means on this side, I want to make sure that that same seam allowance is also pushed away from me, or now it's on my left, which means I want my lining seam allowance to go to my right. And then I'm going to match those up, and then I'm going to pin this in place. You always want to start with your sides, and I like to, since I want to make sure those seam allowances stay on the side that I want them to stay on, I'm going to pin them into place so that they don't accidentally flip up and I don't sew them in the wrong direction, because all that work would go to waste, which would be sad. So now we're going to flip it to the other side. So I've just pinned that side of the bag. Now I'm going to match it up with this side. And again, I'm checking to see which direction my seam allowance has been sewn down at the box, which is again facing away from me. And now that's going to be on my right side. And then my lining is going to be on the left. Sandwich those together, and you can kind of wiggle those into place and then pin them into place. Do the same thing on the other side of the seam allowance, just to keep that from wiggling around too much. And I'm going to see that so you can see that a little closer. So I have my seam allowance pinned into place there, and both of the seam allowances going in the other directions. And then I'm just going to kind of straighten this all out, make sure that there's no puckering. If you do have some extra gapping, like if your lining in your outside fabric isn't exactly perfect, always match your centers and then distribute the excess, because you don't want to just push it all in one direction, because then it's going to be all wonky. But if you marked your centers, you can match your centers up, and then you can kind of even out any sort of excess that you may have. But that's why I always kind of hold it up into place first, because if I hold it taut and it's not gapping, then I know it's going to work out. I do still kind of work from the center and then go out on either side though. So I would go there, and then I pin normally either through the webbing or right next to either side, just so that it doesn't like slag down, because if it isn't pinned in place, that weight of the strap can kind of make it a little wonky on your seam allowance, like on your lining, on those raw edges. They can sometimes sag a little bit, and then your seam isn't going to be perfectly straight. So I like to just keep that either, again, pinned on either side of my webbing or through my webbing. But that also kind of depends on which pins I have in my hand. If I have some of my nicer pins that are a little more fragile, I'm not going to pin through the webbing. But if I had a sturdier pin, then I might pin through the webbing. So then we're almost done pinning around the sides. So then now we have our bag pinned all the way around. And this is when we would take it to the machine and we would sew all the way around using a 1/2-inch seam allowance. And I'll move this actually closer to my 1/2-inch seam allowance. And I'm going to lower my foot. Now I'm going to remove that pin. And just stop and readjust. And then sew a little bit more. And then I'm going to reverse again over this strap, just again for extra stability. So I'm going to reverse here and then sew forward again. And then I'm going to cut my threads just so that we don't have to sew all the way around. But I would sew all the way around, reversing just once around each strap, just for extra security, because it's better to be safe than sorry. So now that we have our bag sewn all the way around, it's all boxed, everything's nice and pressed here. Now I'm going to turn my bag right side out. And this is when I would take it to the iron, and I would press around the top. And then the last thing you have to do is top stitch. around the outside. So then this is my lining, and I'm just going to tuck that lining into my bag. Sometimes this can get a little twisted, so it may take a second to get it all lined up. But I would then go around, take this to my ironing board and kind of wiggle out that seam, kind of make sure that that is perfectly flush and you have it evenly distributed between your lining and the outside of your fabric. I would do that all the way around, and if you need to, once you've pressed it, if you need to pin it or clip it to keep it in place, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Pin that all the way around, top stitch on your machine. I like to increase my stitch length a little bit, maybe around a 2.5 to 3 for this, and you can top stitch this at really whatever dimension you want. I think around 3/8 of an inch looks really good. And then I would just, again, this would take a little bit, still need to do a little bit more adjusting and finagling here on the bag. But you can also see I've done a couple little extra things on this particular bag. One, I decided, since it was a white bag, I didn't want the white bag sitting on the ground, and then I actually also had a few little stains on them, so I decided to add just little decorative stitches, like little sparkles. Instead of little dirt stains, I have little sparkles on the bag, so that gives it a little bit of a fun little touch. So if you do have an older shirt that isn't exactly in perfect condition, you could either patch it, put a little applique, or use one of your little decorative stitches, and then you have a brand new bag and a brand for an older shirt, and giving it a new life. So I hope you guys have been inspired to break out some of those old t-shirts from either quilt shows or concerts or wherever, or maybe your old college or high school shirts, and break those out and make them into totes for yourself and all of your friends, and probably your family, because they're probably going to steal them for you the way my family does. So I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.